Some things look worthless to the world until they find the person who's been missing them. The photograph was already drifting toward the storm drain when Maya Johnson spotted it. Rain hammered the sidewalk in silver sheets, turning the streets of downtown Charlotte into ribbons of reflected light. Most people hurried past with their heads down, shoulders hunched beneath umbrellas, focused on getting somewhere warm and dry. Nobody noticed the small rectangle of paper spinning in the rushing water. Nobody except Maya. The 9-year-old girl tightened her grip on the stack of newspapers tucked beneath her arm and stepped closer to the curb. Her sneakers were already soaked through. Water squished beneath every step. The cold October rain had been falling for hours, and her thin blue jacket offered little protection against the wind sweeping between the buildings. Still, she stopped. Something about the photograph caught her attention. Maybe it was the smile. Maybe it was the way the picture fought against the current as if it didn't want to disappear. Maya crouched carefully and reached toward the gutter. The icy water splashed across her fingers. For a second, the photograph slipped away. Then she caught it just before it vanished into the dark opening of the drain. She pulled it free and stared at it. The edges were worn. The paper was old. Rainwater dripped from the corners as she turned it over in her hands. On the front was a young girl, no older than 8 or 9, standing beneath bright summer sunlight. Her blonde hair danced in the breeze. Her smile seemed so genuine that it felt alive despite the years. Maya brushed a drop of water from the image. "You almost got lost," she whispered softly. The girl in the photograph smiled back, forever frozen in time. A car horn sounded nearby. Maya glanced up. Across the street, people streamed from a large stone building. Nearly everyone wore black. Some carried flowers. Others spoke quietly as they moved toward waiting vehicles. At the center of the gathering stood a tall man surrounded by security personnel. Even from half a block away, Maya recognized him immediately. Richard Sterling. Everyone knew who he was. His face appeared on television, magazines, billboards, and newspaper covers. Billionaire entrepreneur. Philanthropist. One of the richest men in America. Yet today he looked nothing like the confident businessman she had seen in photographs. His shoulders seemed heavy. His expression distant. The rain rolled down the dark fabric of his coat while he stood motionless beside a black limousine. Maya looked back at the photograph. Then she looked again at the crowd. Something felt strange. Familiar. The little girl in the picture. The giant portrait displayed beside the building entrance. Her heart skipped. They were the same person. Maya's eyes widened. The smiling child from the photograph was the same girl whose image stood surrounded by white flowers outside the memorial ceremony. She lowered her gaze to the back of the photograph. Most of the ink had faded with time and rain, but a few words remained visible. 3 simple words. "If found, please return." Maya stared at the message while raindrops tapped softly against the paper. Then she looked up toward Richard Sterling just as his security team opened the limousine door. Without another thought, she clutched the photograph tightly against her chest and began running through the rain. Maya splashed through ankle-deep puddles, weaving between pedestrians who barely noticed her. The photograph remained pressed safely against her chest beneath her jacket, protected from the worst of the rain. Ahead, the line of black vehicles had already begun moving toward the curb. Security personnel guided guests into waiting cars while assistants carried bouquets wrapped in clear plastic. Everything seemed organized, polished, distant. Maya was still half a block away when the limousine door started to close. "Wait," she shouted. Her voice vanished beneath the sound of traffic and rain. She ran faster. Her backpack bounced against her shoulders. The newspaper she had not yet delivered shifted under her arm. By the time she reached the edge of the crowd, her lungs burned and her legs ached. A security guard stepped forward immediately. "Careful there, kid." Maya stopped, trying to catch her breath. Water dripped from her. "Braids. I need to give something to him." The guard followed her gaze toward Richard Sterling. "Mr. Sterling is leaving. It is important." The guard offered a polite smile. "I am sure it is, but today is not the best day." Maya glanced down at the photograph. The little girl in the picture seemed to stare back at her with the same bright smile. Something in Maya refused to walk away. "Please," she said quietly. "I think it belongs to him." Before the guard could answer, the limousine door opened again. Richard Sterling had not entered yet. He remained standing beside the vehicle, speaking softly with an older man carrying a black umbrella. Up close, he looked older than he appeared in magazines. The gray at his temples was more noticeable. So were the lines around his eyes. Not the lines of age alone, but the lines of someone who had spent years carrying something heavy. Maya noticed something else. While everyone around him talked, moved, or checked their phones, Richard seemed detached from the world around him, as if part of him stood somewhere else entirely. The security guard gently motioned for Maya to step back. "Come on, kid. Time to head home." Maya hesitated. Then she remembered her grandmother's voice. "If something belongs to someone, you keep trying until it gets home." She swallowed hard and raised the photograph above her head. "Sir." This time the word cut through the noise. Richard turned. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough for his eyes to settle on the small figure standing beyond the security line. For a moment, nobody moved. Rain tapped against umbrellas. Tires hissed across wet pavement. Maya stepped forward and held out the photograph with both hands. "I found this." One of the security guards took the picture first. He looked at it briefly, confused. Then he handed it toward Richard. Maya watched as the billionaire accepted it absent-mindedly. At first, there was no reaction. His gaze remained distant, almost empty. Then his eyes focused. The change was immediate. His shoulders stiffened. The color drained from his face. He stared at the photograph without blinking. Seconds passed. The older man beside him stopped talking. The security team exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody understood what they were seeing. Richard carefully turned the photograph over. His fingers trembled. Rain collected along the edges of the worn paper. Maya could not hear his breathing from where she stood, but she saw the way his chest rose and fell unevenly. Then something unexpected happened. The billionaire lowered his head. His eyes closed. And for the first time since the memorial service had ended, the carefully controlled mask he had worn all afternoon began to crack. The world around Richard Sterling seemed to fade into a blur of gray rain and distant noise. He stared at the photograph as though it had appeared from another lifetime. Water slid from the edge of the paper onto his fingers, but he did not seem to notice. The older man beside him shifted uneasily. "Richard." No response. The billionaire's eyes remained fixed on the image. Slowly, he traced the outline of the smiling girl with his thumb. The motion was gentle, almost reverent. Maya stood quietly several feet away. She did not understand why the photograph mattered so much. She only knew that something important had happened the moment he saw it. One of the security guards lowered his radio. Another stopped scanning the crowd. The entire group seemed suspended in an unusual silence. Finally, Richard lifted his gaze toward Maya. His eyes looked different now. Softer. Less guarded. "Where did you find this?" His voice was low, rough around the edges. Maya pointed toward the street behind her. Near a storm drain 3 blocks away. It was floating in the water. Richard swallowed. His jaw tightened. Then he looked back at the photograph. 3 blocks, he repeated quietly. The words sounded less like a question and more like a memory. Rain continued to fall steadily across the city. Guests from the memorial had almost completely disappeared. The flower arrangements near the building entrance glistened beneath the wet afternoon light. Maya glanced toward the large portrait standing beside the doors. The smiling girl in the display looked exactly like the one in the photograph. "Was she your daughter?" she asked softly. Nobody around her seemed prepared for the question. The security guards exchanged brief glances. The older man lowered his umbrella slightly. Richard remained still for several seconds. Then he nodded once. "Yes." Maya looked back toward the portrait. She looked happy. A faint expression crossed Richard's face. Not quite a smile. Not quite sadness. Something in between. She was. His answer came almost as a whisper. For years, Richard Sterling had become known as a man who never spoke about his personal life. Interviews focused on business. Headlines focused on investments. Public appearances focused on charity projects and corporate announcements. Yet everyone knew there had once been a daughter. And everyone knew she was gone. Few knew anything beyond that. Fewer still knew what happened afterward. The loss had changed him. Friends said he became quieter. Employees said he stopped celebrating achievements. Reporters described him as distant. The world saw success, wealth, influence. But beneath it all was a grief that never truly left. Richard turned the photograph over again. His eyes narrowed slightly as he examined the faded writing on the back. Water droplets clung to the paper fibers. Most of the ink had nearly disappeared with time. Yet the surviving words remained visible. "If found, please return." He closed his eyes briefly. A long breath escaped his chest. "I cannot believe this," he murmured. The older man stepped closer. "What is it?" Richard opened his eyes and carefully held up the photograph. "This picture disappeared 12 years ago." Silence followed. Even the rain seemed quieter. Maya blinked. 12 years. That was longer than she had been alive. Richard looked toward the dark clouds overhead. Memories moved behind his eyes like distant shadows. "She carried this photograph everywhere," he said. "Everywhere." His voice faltered slightly. Then he looked directly at Maya again. "There is something you need to know about this picture." Richard held the photograph carefully, as if the paper itself might crumble beneath the weight of memory. Rain rolled down the sleeve of his coat and dripped from his fingertips, but he never looked away from the image. "My daughter, Emily, received this picture on her 8th birthday," he said quietly. "She carried it everywhere. School trips, family vacations. Even when she visited my office, this photograph was always with her." Maya listened without speaking. The city seemed strangely still around them. Traffic continued moving through the wet streets, yet the sounds felt distant now. Richard turned the photograph toward the light filtering through the clouds. One day it disappeared. "We searched for weeks." Emily cried when she realized it was gone. A faint smile touched his face before fading again. "I promised her we would find it." The older man standing beside him lowered his gaze. He had clearly heard this story before. Richard looked down at the worn paper. "We never did." Maya studied the photograph. It was hard to imagine someone missing a single picture for so many years. Yet the way Richard held it made it seem priceless. "Maybe it was waiting," she said softly. Richard blinked. "Waiting?" Maya nodded. "For the right day to come back." The billionaire stared at her for a moment. There was no calculation in her voice. No attempt to comfort him with polished words. Just the simple honesty of a child. And somehow that made the statement harder to ignore. The older man shifted beneath his umbrella. "Richard, perhaps we should get out of the rain." Richard did not answer immediately. His eyes had returned to the back of the photograph. Something about the faded writing continued to bother him. He ran his thumb gently across the paper. Then he frowned. "That is strange." One of the security guards stepped closer. "Sir." Richard tilted the photograph slightly. "There is more writing here than I remember." Maya watched him carefully. Most of the ink had faded into pale streaks. Rainwater and time had erased nearly everything. Yet beneath the surviving words, faint impressions remained. Almost invisible. Richard's expression tightened. This was not here before. The older man leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I have looked at copies of this photograph hundreds of times over the years." Richard's voice dropped lower. "I would have remembered additional writing." The rain softened to a gentle mist. Richard carefully slid the photograph inside the inner pocket of his coat. The movement was protective, almost instinctive. Then he looked at Maya again. For the first time, his attention seemed fully present. "What is your name?" "Maya Johnson." "And where were you headed before all of this happened?" Maya lifted the damp stack of newspapers beneath her arm. "Delivering these." Richard glanced at the soaked papers, then at her worn sneakers, then at the rain still falling around them. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not pity, recognition. As though he suddenly understood how much effort it had taken for a little girl to chase down a stranger simply to return something that was never hers. He looked toward the waiting limousine, then back toward Maya. "I think," he said slowly, "there is something about this photograph neither of us understands yet." For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving only a fine mist hanging in the cool afternoon air. Water dripped from the edges of umbrellas and rolled slowly down the windows of the waiting limousine. Maya shifted the damp newspapers under her arm. She still had deliveries to finish. Her grandmother would be wondering why she was late. Yet something in Richard's voice made her feel that this moment was not finished. The billionaire reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed the photograph once more. This time he studied the back more closely. The faded ink seemed different now that the paper was beginning to dry. Tiny marks appeared beneath the original writing, almost hidden beneath years of wear. Richard narrowed his eyes. "I need better light." The older man beside him immediately opened the rear door of the limousine. Warm light spilled onto the wet pavement. Richard stepped closer to the open doorway and angled the photograph beneath the interior reading lamp. One of the security guards quietly moved beside him. The others maintained their distance. Nobody interrupted. Richard's expression grew more focused with every passing second. Then his breathing changed. Not dramatically, just enough for Maya to notice. "What is it?" the older man asked. Richard did not answer immediately. His gaze remained locked on the paper. Slowly, he reached into his briefcase and removed a pair of reading glasses. Maya watched him place them on carefully before looking again. Several more seconds passed. Then he whispered something so softly that nobody heard it. "Richard?" the older man repeated. The billionaire finally looked up. His eyes were filled with disbelief. Emily wrote something else. Silence followed. The older man blinked. "What?" Richard held the photograph beneath the light. There was another message hidden beneath the first one. Maya stepped slightly closer. She could not read the faded letters from where she stood. Richard swallowed hard before speaking again. The ink must have faded over the years. "I never saw it." His voice carried a mixture of wonder and regret. 12 years. 12 years of searching for answers, preserving memories, collecting photographs, replaying conversations. Yet this tiny piece of paper had been carrying a secret all along. Richard carefully traced the faint writing with his finger. She must have written it herself. The older man lowered his umbrella completely now. Rain no longer mattered. "What does it say?" Richard stared at the message for several seconds before answering. His eyes glistened beneath the soft light. "It says, 'Daddy, if you ever lose this picture, it means I am still with you.'" The words seemed to settle over the street like a quiet snowfall. Nobody spoke. Maya looked toward the portrait beside the memorial building and then back toward Richard. For the first time since she had met him, she saw something other than grief in his face. It was not happiness. Not yet. It was something gentler, like the first ray of sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. Richard closed his eyes. The photograph trembled slightly in his hands. And standing there beside the open limousine, surrounded by wet pavement and fading rain, he realized that a little girl he had never met had just returned far more than a photograph. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard Sterling's private office, illuminating the photograph resting carefully beneath a sheet of protective glass. What had seemed like a simple discovery the day before had become something much larger overnight. Specialists had examined the faded paper using advanced imaging technology. Every hidden mark, every trace of ink buried beneath years of wear, had been recovered. Richard sat alone at his desk as the final report lay open before him. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Then they stopped. His breathing caught. For several seconds, he simply stared. The restored message was longer than anyone had expected. Much longer. The words Maya had helped uncover were only the beginning. Beneath them was another note written in Emily's uneven childhood handwriting. A note nobody had ever known existed. Richard read it again. Then again. Tears gathered in his eyes before he even realized it. 12 years earlier, on a warm summer afternoon, Emily had written a private message on the back of the photograph. She had never shown it to anyone. Not her teachers. Not her friends. Not even her father. The note read, "Daddy, if you ever lose this picture, it means I am still with you. And if someone kind brings it back, promise me you will help them the way you always help me." Richard lowered the paper and closed his eyes. The office felt impossibly quiet. Outside, the city moved through another ordinary morning. Cars filled the streets. People hurried to work. Yet inside that room, time seemed to stand still. Emily's words echoed through his heart. Not because they sounded miraculous. Not because they predicted the future. But because they sounded exactly like her. Even after all these years, he could hear her voice in every sentence. A soft knock interrupted the silence. His assistant entered carrying a tablet. "Sir, the team finished reviewing the security footage from yesterday." Richard looked up, and the little girl never asked for anything. She did not know who you were until she saw the memorial banner. Richard nodded slowly. Somehow that mattered. More than he could explain. She had not returned the photograph for a reward. She had not expected recognition. She had simply done what she believed was right. His gaze returned to Emily's message. "If someone kind brings it back." The word seemed almost impossible now. Out of millions of people in a city of strangers, the photograph had found its way into the hands of a child whose first instinct was honesty. A child who had chased a limousine through rain simply because something did not belong to her. Richard stood and walked toward the window. Below, Charlotte stretched into the distance beneath clear blue skies. For years, grief had convinced him that life only took things away. Yesterday, A little girl had challenged that belief without even trying. His phone rested silently on the desk behind him. Next to it sat a folder containing Maya Johnson's address, school records, and newspaper delivery route. Richard looked at the photograph one final time. Then a faint smile appeared on his face. The first genuine smile anyone in his office had seen in years. Because for the first time in 12 years, he no longer felt like he had lost the final message his daughter wanted him to hear. He finally understood it. Maya was halfway through her newspaper route when a black sedan pulled quietly to the curb beside her. The morning air felt crisp after the storm, and sunlight reflected from puddles that still lingered along the sidewalk. She looked up cautiously. The rear door opened, and Richard Sterling stepped out. There were no cameras, no reporters, no large group of assistants. Just the billionaire and a small leather folder tucked beneath one arm. Maya blinked in surprise. "Mr. Sterling?" Richard smiled gently. "Good morning, Maya." She adjusted the stack of newspapers she carried. "Did something happen?" Richard glanced at the folder in his hands. "Actually, something good happened." Maya waited. Richard had spent most of the previous night thinking about Emily's message. Every word had stayed with him. Not because it instructed him to do something extraordinary, but because it reminded him of the values his daughter cared about most. Kindness, honesty, seeing people who often went unnoticed. Standing there on the sidewalk, he realized that Maya had already done all those things without expecting anything in return. "Would you walk with me for a minute?" he asked. Maya nodded. Together they moved slowly down the block. Cars passed. Store owners opened their doors for the day. The city continued its routine without noticing the unusual pair walking side by side. After a moment, Richard spoke. "Yesterday you returned something that meant more to me than you could ever know." Maya looked down. "I was just bringing it back." "Exactly." Richard smiled. "You did not do it for money." "No, you did not do it for attention." "No, sir." Richard stopped walking. "You did it because it was the right thing to do." Maya shrugged slightly. "My grandmother says that doing the right thing matters most when nobody is watching." Richard laughed softly. The words sounded so much like something Emily would have appreciated. He opened the leather folder and removed several documents. "I met with your school principal this morning." Maya's eyes widened. "You did?" "I did." Richard handed her a single sheet of paper. "And I learned that you were one of the best students in your grade." Maya stared at the page without fully understanding it. Richard continued. "I am establishing a scholarship fund in Emily's name. The first student it will support is you." Maya looked up immediately. "Me?" "Yes." Her eyes grew wider. "But I did not do anything special." Richard felt his throat tighten. That was exactly the point. The kindest people rarely believed they had done anything extraordinary. They simply acted from the heart. "You reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago," he said quietly. Maya looked confused. "What?" Richard glanced toward the bright morning sky. "That some of the most important things in life cannot be bought. They can only be given." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Maya smiled. It was small, genuine, the kind of smile that asked for nothing. Richard smiled back. And for the first time in many years, the weight he had carried felt just a little lighter. 6 months later, spring sunlight poured through the tall windows of a brand new community library on the east side of Charlotte. The building was not the largest project Richard Sterling had ever funded. It was not the most expensive, yet it had become the one he visited most often. Children filled the reading areas with quiet laughter and whispered conversations. Rows of books stretched across bright shelves painted in warm colors. Near the entrance stood a bronze plaque bearing a simple inscription: "The Emily Sterling Learning Center." Richard paused beside it every time he arrived, not out of sadness anymore, but gratitude. Inside, Maya Johnson sat at a corner table with a stack of books nearly as tall as her arm. Sunlight rested across the pages while she worked through a science project for school. Her grandmother sat nearby in a comfortable chair, listening to an audiobook through a pair of headphones. The scholarship had opened doors Maya never imagined, but the things she valued most had not changed. She still smiled at strangers. She still returned lost items. She still believed kindness mattered even when nobody noticed. Richard watched from a distance. He rarely interrupted her study time. Instead, he sat quietly with a cup of coffee and allowed himself to enjoy something he had forgotten was possible: peace. Years earlier, grief had turned every memory into a source of pain. Every photograph felt like a reminder of what was gone. Every anniversary felt heavier than the one before. But the picture that had once disappeared into a storm drain had somehow returned carrying more than memories. It had brought perspective. It had reminded him that love did not vanish simply because time moved forward. Sometimes it survived in unexpected ways. A librarian approached Maya's table carrying a small framed photograph. "This belongs in the display case," she said. Maya smiled and accepted it carefully. Richard immediately recognized the image. It was the restored photograph of Emily. The paper had been preserved and protected behind museum-quality glass. Beside it sat a copy of the handwritten message discovered on the back. Visitors often stopped to read it. Many never knew the entire story. They only saw a photograph, a note from a daughter, and a reminder that kindness can travel farther than anyone expects. Maya carried the frame toward the display case near the entrance. She adjusted it gently until it sat perfectly straight. Then she stepped back. Richard noticed her studying the image for a moment before turning away with a satisfied nod. No speeches followed. No ceremony. No applause. Just a quiet moment in a room filled with books, sunlight, and ordinary people living ordinary lives. Outside, a light breeze moved through the trees lining the sidewalk. Inside, the restored photograph rested beneath soft afternoon light. Richard slipped his hands into his pockets and looked around the library one more time. Children reading. Families learning. Maya smiling as she returned to her books. For the first time in many years, the silence around him no longer felt empty. It felt full. And as sunlight reflected softly across the glass protecting the photograph, it almost seemed as though Emily's smile had found its way home at last.